Imagine, for a moment, that inside your skull there is not a static organ, a sealed machine whose parts were cast at birth and rust slowly with time, but a living landscape, a garden that keeps growing, pruning, surprising you with late-blooming flowers and stubborn weeds. Paths appear where footsteps are often taken, hedges thicken where you shelter, new tunnels are carved through the soil when rain and attention conspire to dissolve old barriers. This garden is your brain. The name we give to its restless capacity is simple and strange: neuroplasticity. It is the fact that the brain is not finished. It remakes itself in response to everything you do, think, suffer, love, and choose to notice. To call neuroplasticity merely a scientific term would be to put it in a jar and forget to feed it. It is an idea that reaches into ethics, identity, recovery, and the quiet drama of everyday life. It is the gentle promise, and the stern warning, that who you are does not belong wholly to your past wiring. Yet it also insists that the past has its weight, repetition, trauma, and neglect are as effective as instruction in shaping the map of your mind. I want this chapter to be both a doorway and a mirror. I will tell you what neuroplasticity is in its simplest truth, but I will also try to make you feel what it means, the tenderness of repair, the cruelty of habit, the astonishment of sudden change. I will show how tiny electrical whispers between cells become the scaffolding of memory, skill, and suffering. And I will begin to ask the questions that will visit us again and again in the chapters to come. To what extent can we choose to rewire? How much of our destiny is a learned groove, and how much can be softened by attention and practice? What is the ethics of changing the brain, for healing, for advantage, for escape? At the microscopic level, the story is both elegant and humble. Neurons, the brain cells, speak in spikes of electricity and gestures of chemistry. Where one neuron meets another, a synapse exists, a narrow gap across which neurotransmitters sail, tiny messengers that persuade the receiving cell to be louder or quieter next time. When two neurons frequently whisper to one another, the bridge between them tends to grow stronger. This is the kernel of the famous aphorism, "Cells that fire together, wire together." That phrase, born from decades of experiments, is not a quaint motto, it is a principle. Through processes called long-term potentiation and long-term depression, synapses become more or less sensitive, effectively tuning the brain towards certain patterns of activity. But plasticity is not only about strength at the synapse. The brain reorganizes in layers, synaptic weights shift, but neurons also rearrange their territory, axons grow or retract, dendrites sprout new spines like leaf buds. In some regions, new neurons can be born in adulthood, adding fresh actors to the stage. Glial cells, once dismissed as mere support, participate in pruning connections and in controlling local chemical environments. Myelin sheaths thicken along frequently used highways, speeding communication. Together, these processes constitute a chorus of change. They are the biological machinery that underlies learning a language, recovering a lost movement, or being trapped in a recurring pattern of fear. There is poetry here, and there is a sobering counterpoint. Plasticity creates both healing and harm. It is the reason a child who practices the piano for years can play with a fluency that seems to bloom from the bones, and it is also why a person can come to inhabit an addiction, the same mechanisms that strengthen skill can strengthen compulsion. Neural pathways are like well-trodden trails through a field. The first time you climb over the fence it is hard, by the 10th time, the grass is flattened, the stones settled. To forge a new path, the healthier habit, a new skill, a revised perspective, requires intention and repetition. To allow an old path to dominate, avoidance, resentment, self-criticism, is to let its edges grow obvious and deep. Think of a woman named Amina, a mother who lost the use of her dominant right hand after a stroke. Her life narrowed to accommodations she never wanted to learn. Then, in rehabilitation, she was asked to do tiny, absurd tasks, pick up a pill, move a clothespin an inch to the left, trace a circle. At first nothing happened, the hand was a foreign country. Yet day by day, with focused attention and graded challenge, the hand became less foreign. New routes were coaxed into existence. The brain, deprived of its usual maps, took pieces from other regions and reallocated them, adjacent areas expanded to shoulder the load. Months later, Amina could feed herself, button a blouse, feel again a fragile sense of agency. This is not magic. It is plasticity gifted with structure, challenge plus repetition plus feedback plus time. But the story can run the other way, too. Consider an adolescent learning to take refuge in anger because it reliably shields him from grief. His nervous system, rewarded by the short-term relief of emotional distance, builds scaffolding around that response. Neural circuits that encode vigilance and readiness for confrontation become easier to activate. Over time, his temperament may look like destiny, quick to snap, hard to soften. There is a moral ambiguity to plasticity. It frees us but also locks us in. It is both the basis of hope and the source of stubborn suffering. To understand how plasticity happens across a lifetime, we must step back and recognize a pattern, windows of heightened receptivity, critical periods, and a wider, ongoing capacity for change. In infancy and childhood, certain circuits are especially malleable: language acquisition, sensory maps of the world, attachment bonds. A child placed in a stimulating environment learns language with an ease adults often envy. Deprived of sufficient input, language and sensory systems can be impaired in ways that are difficult to reverse. Yet adulthood does not mean immutability. While the brain's flexibility declines in some respects, pruning and myelination narrow possibilities, new learning, environmental change, and targeted practice can still reshape it. The metaphor is helpful: the early years are soft clay, adulthood is firmer clay, but still able to be molded with effort. There is a modern mythology that plasticity is a cure-all, a tidy lever we can pull to fix any fault. The scientific reality is more nuanced. Neuroplastic mechanisms are context-sensitive. They are influenced by stress hormones, sleep, inflammation, social connectedness, nutrition, and even the meanings we attribute to our experiences. A stroke patient with supportive relationships and daily purposeful practice recovers better than one who languishes unattended. A learner who sleeps well consolidates memory more effectively than one who pulls an all-night cram. The brain does not rewire in isolation, it rewires in a body that is steeped in a social world. And so we circle back to the ethical and existential implications. If the brain is malleable, if it is always becoming, then identity itself is porous. The stories we tell about ourselves, I am anxious, I'm not a morning person, I can't trust people, are not mere descriptions. They are rehearsal scripts. Say I am often enough, and neural patterns conspire to make it true. Conversely, to speak a new story and to live into it measures the first gentle strokes of change. That is not to imply moral blame for the past. Many of our grooves are carved by forces outside our control: neglect, socio-economic pressures, abuse. But it does mean that our capacity to change can be cultivated. Language matters here. The words used in medicine and psychology have teeth. When clinicians say rewiring, they are speaking metaphorically about synaptic change. When a coach says build new habits, they are invoking repetition, feedback, and environmental design. When a philosopher asks whether an altered brain still counts as the same person, they are probing the seam between the continuity of narrative identity and the incremental changes of mind. Neuroplasticity reframes these questions. It suggests that personal transformation is not some metaphysical sleight of hand but a biological fact. Yet it also warns that transformation is not purely volitional, it is constrained by history, biology, and circumstance. There are moments when plasticity reveals its deep tenderness. In empathy, for instance, we see how social attunement can alter the brain. A therapist's steadiness, a friend's mirror, an attentive partner, these social inputs scaffold new ways of perceiving emotions. Neural circuits that had been hypervigilant can find rest. This is not ethereal consolation. Measurable changes in connectivity and reactivity often follow prolonged, intentionally relational experiences. The interpersonal becomes the neurological. The smallness of a supportive touch or a listening ear cascades into cellular adjustments that lighten fear's architecture. Equally, there is cruelty in the way experience gets embedded. Trauma teaches the brain to expect danger, it biases perception toward threat. Months or years spent in unbearable conditions leave traces, tightened circuits, sensorium tuned to alarms, that make ordinary life feel perilous. Recovery from trauma is not simply erasing memory, it is building new contexts in which the old memory no longer commands the whole theater. Exposure, safety, re-narration, and social repair are the ordinary tools of this work. The brain's capacity to reconfigure gives room for healing, but that healing is laborious and sacred work. Science offers breathtaking examples of neuroplasticity at work. Musicians' brains reorganize with practice. London taxi drivers who memorize the city's labyrinth show structural changes in navigation-related areas. Blind individuals may use formerly visual cortices for touch and hearing, repurposing brain real estate. Yet these examples are not tricks to marvel at and forget. They are reminders that function follows use. If you want a brain that is patient, you cultivate patience. If you want a brain that is curious, you nurture curiosity. Not by magical thinking, but by arranging your life so that certain patterns are practiced often enough to be internalized. Let us not be naive about the limits, though. Plasticity does not mean invulnerability. Age-related decline, neurodegenerative illnesses, genetic vulnerabilities, these impose constraints that plasticity cannot fully overcome. But even within limits, the brain's capacity to adapt often yields significant improvements in function and quality of life. Consider the person who, after a diagnosis that threatens identity, chooses to learn new ways of living. That decision interacts with neurobiology in unpredictable but real ways. The narrative of plasticity is not a sales pitch for endless self-optimization. It is a recognition that within the tension of possibility and limitation, small changes matter. Finally, there is a deeper philosophical invitation here, to think about time and causality differently. Our past experiences shape neural wiring, and that wiring shapes future behavior, which shapes future wiring in a loop. We are at once the product of this loop and its agent. The practices we embed, rituals of sleep, movement, reflection, social connection, are the gardener's tools. They do not conjure change overnight. They press gently, over weeks and months and years, and the soil yields. As you close this chapter, notice a small fact about your own life. What habit arises without question? What phrase repeats in your mind like a chant? What small action could you try differently tomorrow? Neuroplasticity is an idea that asks for curiosity rather than urgency. It asks you to observe the garden. Which paths have you been following unthinkingly, and which might you want to reroute? There is hope in this realism. The brain's plasticity is not a guarantee, but it is a possibility tethered to practice, environment, and relationship. It asks for humility, for patience with the slowness of biological change, for compassion toward the pains that hardened neural grooves represent, and for courage to experiment with new living patterns without assuming instant perfection. In the chapters that follow, we will witness the biology in finer detail, hear stories of recovery and of habit, and explore specific practices that support adaptive rewiring. We will examine the social and moral dimensions of intentionally changing the mind, and we will not shy away from the hard questions about coercion and enhancement. For now, carry this image of a living garden, neither wholly wild nor wholly tamed, always responsive to the hands that tend it. Neuroplasticity is the earth beneath that garden, a fact about living brains that invites us to take responsibility for what we cultivate, and to hold open the persistent tenderness of possibility. Hold your hands in front of you and imagine, really imagine, that they are clay warmed by a kill of experience. Not the clay of fate, imprinted and finished, but pliant, threaded with fibers that remember every touch. This is how the brain feels when you listen closely, like an artisan's piece being worked, the hands moving, smoothing, pressing, and sometimes, with a small, stubborn flourish, adding a new ridge where none existed before. The hands belong to a sculptor named Attention. Wherever attention rests, change gathers. Where it wanders, the surface hardens into habit. Attention is not a moral force and not a mere willpower trick. It is the brain's most intimate teacher. When you focus on a word, a face, a sorrow, or the way your breath touches the top of your lip, neural populations begin to whisper in chorus. These whispers strengthen, first tentatively and then with an insistence that bends other elements of the mind around them. The neural circuits that correspond to what you attend to become more readily activated the next time you call them. The story is ancient and simple: what you notice, you nourish. What you ignore, you forget. Consider a man who returns home after years away, from a city that is both familiar and strange. He walks the same street, but this time he notices the crooked telephone pole, the shop with a new name, the child who has grown taller. These observations are not passive, they are tiny acts of creation. Each moment of noticing is a decision inside the brain to allocate resources, sensory processing becomes heightened, memory consolidation is invited, the threads of perception are rewoven. Over time, deliberate attention can transform how we perceive even familiar places. In the same way, deliberate attention reshapes feelings, softening reactive edges, widening the aperture of compassion, or hardening resolve. Emotions are the clay's kill. They color and quicken plastic change in ways that reason alone cannot. A joyful discovery breathes life into circuits that encode curiosity, adrenaline floods the system during fear and sharpens some forms of learning while narrowing others. Emotion stamps salience onto experience. The same sentence read in the neutral light of a textbook and read during a lover's embrace will lodge differently in the brain. That is why stories matter so much. They are emotional engines that attach significance to sequences of events, making some pathways more likely to be traveled again. The architecture of memory is not neutral scaffolding, it is the residue of feeling. Memory itself is not a single room but a sprawling house with many chambers. There are rooms of knowing how and rooms of knowing that. There are diaries of the body, the procedural memories that allow fingers to dance on keys or a foot to find the balance of a bicycle without thought, and there are the archives of narrative memory, where faces and facts are shelved with the scent of context. When we practice, procedural systems hum quietly and consolidate patterns that later run beneath the threshold of awareness. When we rehearse stories, the narrative of our lives, those circuits integrate events into a continuous thread that feels like identity. But memory is also a creative act. It does not merely replay, it reconstructs. Each recollection is an act of remaking, and therefore an opportunity to reshape the brain. That is why reflective practices, telling and retelling, reinterpreting moments, can change how memories feel and how they influence behavior. A memory of humiliation, once retold in a different frame, can loosen its grip. A trauma, when named and held in a safer context, may be decoded into smaller, less omnipotent parts. The act of remembering is a kind of rehearsal that invites plastic change. Sleep is the quiet caretaker of all this remodeling. While you dream and drift, synapses hum in tidy reorganization, some connections are pruned, others are reinforced, the day's clutter is sorted into durable patterns. Without sleep, the brain's ability to consolidate learning falters, its capacity to adjust and adapt is impaired. Sleep is not passive rest but an active workshop where the materials of the day are measured and laid into new designs. It is the scaffold upon which attention and emotion are given form. To neglect sleep is to deny the sculptor time in the studio. We are often tempted to place the whole drama of change inside the skull, as if individual effort alone were the engine of transformation. This temptation is seductive and cruel. The brain rewires in a body and inside a culture. The breath you take, the food you eat, the rhythms of your day, the touch of another hand, the steadiness of a partner, the brutality of poverty, the presence of war, these shape the brain as surely as any internal thought. Biology is porous. Social conditions prime physiology, chronic stress raises cortisol and makes some kinds of plasticity more probable and others less so, companionship releases oxytocin and opens neurochemical gates to connection. The same practice will yield different changes in different climates of life. Thus the ethics of plasticity cannot ignore inequality. Some people are given tools and safe studios, others are left to work with blunt implements in the dark. There is a dark artistry to some forms of plasticity. Despair can deepen like a trench, addiction can map itself into rigid loops. When certain networks are repeatedly rewarded, by relief, by avoidance, by substances, they become easier to call upon in the future. The brain learns the path of least resistance as an economy of survival. This economy is not a moral sentence, it is adaptation to cues in the environment. But it can trap. Understanding the trap is the first step toward escape. Escape requires not mere will but a reconfiguration of context, removing triggers, creating safer routines, and introducing new rewards that can compete with the old circuits. In the middle of this sculpting, there is a surprising collaborator, imagination. The mind's eye is not fantasy divorced from fact, it is rehearsal that changes brain structure much like physical action does. Athletes who imagine perfect throws strengthen motor circuits, musicians who vividly rehearse passages benefit from neural changes similar to practice. Imagination is cheap rehearsal, portable, safe, and endlessly repeatable. It allows us to build new pathways in the absence of external practice, to test oneself in a mental laboratory where mistakes leave no physical marks but may sculpt neural readiness. The ethical dimension is striking. To the extent that human beings can train themselves in silence and solitude, we gain small powers over our future selves. Learning is not always smooth. The brain has what neuroscientists call metaplasticity, the plasticity of plasticity. It means the brain's readiness to change depends on its recent history. A neuron that has become less excitable resists some forms of learning. A brain flooded with stress hormones will lock certain pathways into rigidity. Change, therefore, is sometimes a negotiation rather than a conquest. Patience becomes not just a virtue but a technical requirement. We fail when we expect immediate transformation, and worse, we blame ourselves for the slow mathematics of biological change. Understanding metaplasticity invites compassion. Small attempts accumulate, and even failed practice teaches the nervous system something about effort, endurance, and limits. There are technologies and therapies that accelerate some forms of rewiring, repetition schedules, spaced learning, graded exposure therapies, therapies that combine movement and speech. But these are not miracles. The scaffolding of change remains practice and relationship. A hand that reaches for a new habit must be guided at first with a brain-like scaffolds, external structures that make the internal work simpler. That is why rituals can be powerful. A morning routine, a shared mealtime, a regular walk, these external anchors create predictable contexts in which inner transformation can take hold. We also must reckon with stories we tell about self-change. There is an industry of quick fixes and a culture of hyper-optimization that prizes constant improvement and pathologizes stasis. Plasticity, in that market, becomes ammunition for pressure. You must always be better, faster, more adaptive. This misses the point. Plasticity offers possibility, not obligation. It asks us to choose projects worthy of our attention. It invites us to ask, what life do we want to learn into being? Not how quickly can we rewire to chase the latest efficiency hack, but what kinds of meaning do we want our neural circuits to betray when the lights go down? This is a moral question as much as it is a neurological one. Stories of unexpected resilience dot the landscape of plasticity. People who recover speech after strokes, who relearn trust after betrayal, who find new identities after the collapse of old ones, these are the miracles of slow biology and steadfast practice. But equally instructive are quieter stories, the older woman who learns to dance at 70 and who, over months, finds her gait steadier and her days brighter, the father who tries, for the first time, to listen to his child without offering solutions and finds that his default reactivity softens, the person who, after years of anxious nights, cultivates a practice of writing gratitude and discovers that sleep returns with more ease. The changes are incremental, the cumulative effect is profound. If the sculptor's hands are attention, then the other tools are rhythm, repetition, rest, relationship, and meaning. Rhythm organizes time, repetition grinds the new form into solidity, rest consolidates, relationship supplies the social chemicals that make change sticky, and meaning makes the work worth doing. When these elements align, the brain rewires not as a project of heroic, isolated force but as a woven thing, life practices braided together with small acts of courage. And yet the question remains, how much can we change? The answer is both generous and bounded. The brain can adapt in remarkable ways, it is not a destiny sealed at birth. But it is also constrained by genetics, early experience, illness, and social conditions. That dual truth demands humility. It asks that we support one another in the long, uncertain work of becoming, that we design societies where people have time and safety to tend their studios, and that we resist the urge to place the burden of change solely on the individual. As you close this chapter, imagine again the sculptor at work. Not a lone genius but a person surrounded by tools and friends, light pouring through a workshop window, some days losing progress and others discovering a line that finally satisfies. Notice where you direct your attention in the coming week. Notice what you choose to imagine. Turn small acts into rituals. Let sleep be your ally, and let compassion be the bench at which you sit when the work is hard. The brain is not only a machine for survival but an instrument for making meaning. Its plasticity means we are not merely passengers of a predetermined track, we are co-authors of the landscapes we inhabit. Yet co-authoring is slow, communal, and often unromantic. It requires ordinary courage, showing up, repeating small tasks, forgiving relapse, and acknowledging that transformation is less often a bolt of revelation and more often the steady carving of love, for oneself, for others, for the life one wishes to grow. There is a precise cruelty and a quiet kindness in habits. They pare down the dizzy spaciousness of possibility into something manageable, repeatable, reliable. Habit is the brain's way of saying, the world is too big to decide about every small thing, so let us learn what we can do automatically and save conscious attention for what truly needs it. In the shaping of the brain, habits are the deep grooves that keep the cart of life from skidding. They are the apprenticeship by which a scattered mind becomes skillful, and at the same time they are the lock that can hold a person captive. Imagine a city at dawn. The streets are empty but for a single courier whose feet know the alleys without looking. He does not have to think of each turn, his muscles and his mind are in rough accord. That courier is us when we enact habit. The basal ganglia, a set of deep brain structures, smooths the choreography of repeated action until intention need only give the first nudge. What begins as effortful, the first clumsy attempts to learn a language, the shoulders stiff with yoga, the trembling hand of a new parent cradling an infant, becomes effortless with practice. The brain moves responsibility from high, deliberative command centers into circuits optimized for speed and reliability. This delegation is the essence of habit. It is a kind of neural thrift. Habits have architecture. There is a cue, something in the environment or the internal state that calls the habit forward. There is the routine, the action itself, and there is the reward, the consequence that marks the loop as useful and therefore worth keeping. Over time, dopamine, not merely the drug of pleasure but the signal of prediction and learning, updates the value of the routine. When a cue reliably predicts reward, the brain begins to anticipate the pattern, it preloads expectations, and the routine slides into being. The first few repetitions are heavy, by the 100th, the path is worn smooth. This is why tiny choices repeated across days are more powerful than grand resolutions made in an altar moment of will. There is something almost religious about the first weeks of learning a new habit. The early days are full of moral fervor and fragile optimism, and they are also when the system is most malleable. Small victories accumulate, the circuit receives fresh reinforcement. But habit formation is not linear. It is subject to metaplasticity, the past shapes the future's capacity to change. A brain crowded with stress, sleeplessness, or excessive stimulation makes new habits harder to consolidate. The scaffolding of change must therefore include care for the body and mind that host it, sleep to lay the brickwork, nutrition to provide material, social support to keep practice honest and gentle. We do not become our habits in isolation. Context is the silent engineer. The same person may be generous in the presence of a loved one and withdrawn in a crowd, because the cues differ and the rehearsed responses are not universal. This suggests the strategic power of context design. If you cannot change your will, change your environment. Remove the bowl of chips from the countertop and the habit of reaching for a handful is bound to crumble. If a person wants to learn to write each morning, placing a blank notebook on the nightstand is not trivial, it is an instruction to the brain. Habit is not purely inner discipline, it is a conversation between organism and world. There is a moral texture here that demands tenderness. People with histories of scarcity, trauma, and deprivation often have habits that are adaptive in harsh conditions but maladaptive in calmer ones. Hypervigilance, withdrawal, substance use, these are not moral failings but patterns the brain learned to survive. To ask such a person simply to change is to ignore the deep logic of their apprenticeship. Change must be respectful of past learning. It must acknowledge that the old habit once served and that letting it go without replacing its function will leave a void. New routines must provide the utility that the old ones did: comfort, safety, identity, or a sense of coherence. The compassionate approach to change is not coercion but reparation and replacement. There are techniques born of decades of study that make this replacement more possible. One is the practice of breaking down a large goal into micro-actions, not be healthy but walk 10 minutes after breakfast. Another is habit stacking, where a new action is attached to an already established routine. After I brush my teeth, I will meditate for 3 minutes. Repetition in consistent contexts leverages the brain's appetite for predictability. Implementation intentions, the simple plan: if X happens, then I will do Y, convert vague intention into situated action. These are not tricks, they are ways of speaking the brain's native grammar. Yet the real art of habit lies in the quality of attention with which one practices. Mechanical repetition without reflection hardens a routine but may not shift the deeper patterns of meaning. One may jog every morning and yet remain spiritually adrift, another may walk with mindful curiosity and find the world rearranged. Consciousness is both the kill of attention and the compass of purpose. Practices that combine action with mindful noticing, deliberate rehearsal suffused with sense and reason, tend to produce richer, more flexible habits. They wire not only movement but also intention. Relapse is part of the story and deserves a central place in any honest account. Change that is framed as success failure breeds shame when the inevitable slip occurs. Neural circuits do not vanish overnight. They weaken with disuse and strengthen with new practice at a pace governed by protein expression, synaptic turnover, and time. When a person returns to an old loop, the brain's history is speaking, not its moral verdict. The compassionate response is not denunciation but curiosity: what triggered the relapse? What need was not met by the new routine? What scaffolding failed? Understanding relapse as information rather than indictment transforms recovery into iterative learning. There are moments when habit becomes identity: I am a runner, I am a smoker, I am patient. Identity is a powerful anchor because it changes the scripts the brain executes. If you see yourself as someone who writes, you will arrange contexts, notice opportunities, and forgive lapses in a way that supports the practice. The danger is when identity ossifies into a prison sentence. The freeing move, then, is to attend to identity as story rather than fact. Stories can be edited, narratives rewritten during the quiet stretches when memories are revisited and reshelved. When changes are framed as experiments in identity, tentative, revisable, supported by small evidences, the work becomes lighter and more human. Technology and modern life complicate the apprenticeship of habit. Devices are designed to capture attention and to create loop rewards that are cheap, immediate, and often shallow. Notification chimes, endless feeds, and the architecture of instant feedback are formidable trainers of specific neural pathways, tuned for rapid salience rather than long-term meaning. To live well in this environment requires an additional craft: attention management. The same principles apply: cues, routines, rewards, but now the environment is built to be addictive. Designing friction, disabling notifications, scheduling focused blocks of time, creating phone-free rituals, becomes a form of ethical housekeeping. We must become the gardeners of our attention against the prescriptive plantings of a commercial culture. There is also an emergent tenderness in social habits. We are wired to learn from others. Imitation is a potent form of plasticity. Rituals practiced in community, shared meals, group exercise, collective music making, are more likely to stick because they are reinforced by belonging. This is the reason families and communities have historically been the primary engines of habit. They scaffold behavior with social reward, expectation, and a shared narrative. In the modern atomized world, recreating those scaffolds consciously becomes a radical act. Finding a class, a group, a partner in practice can be more powerful than solitary striving. Science has discovered surprising leverage points. Memory reconsolidation, a process by which a recalled memory becomes temporarily malleable before being restored, suggests that the moment of recall is an opportunity to rewrite. Therapists use this window to update traumatic memories with new safety information. Educators might use retrieval practice to strengthen accurate knowledge. The practical lesson is that repetition matters, but what we repeat matters even more. Rehearsing fear re-engraves it. Rehearsing safety and competence gives the brain new material to use when the old cue arises. There is a gentle paradox at the heart of habit: to become free we must practice constraint. Freedom is not the absence of routine but the wise selection of routines that embody our values. We choose rituals that carry us toward the life we want to lead, waking with clarity, listening with presence, moving with care, speaking with honesty. Over time, these small acts accumulate into a character that feels less like a mask and more like a home. The neural perspective helps us see why this is so. Repeated actions alter networks, networks exert causal influence on action, action begets a life. Habits are the grammar of that life. As you read this chapter, you may notice a tug, an awareness of some pattern you have rehearsed so often that it has become almost invisible. It could be a small kindness you withhold, a cigarette lit before thinking, a defensive retort that springs like a trap. Notice without judgment. Consider, as a practical experiment, one micro change you might try this week. Place a visual cue in a new location, or decide on a 2-minute practice to attach to an existing routine. Keep sleep and nourishment close to the work. Invite a friend to witness the attempt. And when you slip, which you will, treat the event as data, not doom. Habits are not merely the instruments of efficiency, they are the teachers of what we come to love and endure. They tell us what our life prefers, and in turn, they shape the preferences that define us. The apprenticeship is long, often unglamorous, and sometimes lonely. But it is also the primary method by which the brain converts intention into being. To tend habits with care is to collaborate with the deepest machinery of the self, to learn slowly, to fail kindly, and to craft small fidelities that, like stones in a long road, will one day lead you home. Imagine a city hit by sudden thunder, sirens scream, floodlights catch dust motes, windows rattle. For a while the city is alive with readiness, people sprint to safety, barriers rise, messages stream across every street. That surge of coordinated response is what stress looks like in the brain, a swift mobilization of resources, brilliant and ugly and necessary. The trouble begins when the thunder never stops. When the alarms keep blaring and the floodlights never dim, the city learns to live in a state of vigilance. Streets are barricaded. Shops close early. Children grow up thinking that the world's loudest noise is normal. This is the work that chronic stress does to neural tissue, it sculpts survival into default. Acute stress is evolution's sharp tool. A sudden threat, a charging animal, a speeding car, a house fire, requires attention, adrenaline, a reallocation of blood and cognition. The amygdala, a small almond-shaped structure, lifts its head and signals urgency, the hypothalamus calls a biochemical cascade, the adrenal glands release cortisol and adrenaline, the heart and lungs answer. These reactions save lives. They narrow focus, speed reflexes, and prioritize action over contemplative thought. In the short run, stress is not only useful, it is life-preserving. But the currency of stress is expensive when spent continuously. Chronic activation of the stress system, repeated exposure to danger, persistent worry, unmanaged workplace pressure, prolonged caregiving, or unrelenting poverty changes how neural systems allocate their power. The architecture of attention shifts toward threat detection. The amygdala can become more reactive, lighting up at ambiguous cues. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of planning and inhibition, can become less able to steady those flames. It is tired, its resources taxed by constant emergency. The hippocampus, involved in contextualizing memories and regulating the stress response, can show changes in structure and function after prolonged stress. The immune system registers excessive alarm, and inflammation becomes a persistent background hum. Over time this pattern, called allostatic load, wears on body and brain alike. This is not merely neurobiology described in clean sentences, it is lived experience. Think of a father who returns home from a long shift with a body that has been in high alert all night. He notices the squeak of the floor like a gunshot, a door slam becomes a threat. His child's laughter, intended as play, registers as unpredictability. Or consider the survivor of a violent crime whose nights are occupied by intrusive memories and whose days are arranged around avoidance, routes changed, friends avoided, conversations cut short. The brain remembers what mattered most for survival, but in doing so it sometimes makes the ordinary world feel unsafe. Trauma and chronic stress have different flavors but they intertwine. Trauma often carves abrupt, sharp grooves, a specific event so intense that its memory refuses to sit quietly. Chronic stress, by contrast, layers strain and small wounds across time, endless deadlines, repeated humiliation, prolonged neglect. Both forms leave traces in circuitry, and both are shaped by context, social support, meaning, early attachments, and resources for recovery decide, in large part, how the brain will respond. One of the most important truths about the brain under fire is that it is also the brain that can be soothed. Plasticity works both ways. Just as repeated alarms make reflexes sharper, repeated safety can make systems calmer. Social connection is among the most potent safeguards. A steady, attuned presence, a friend who listens without judgment, a partner who offers practical help, a caregiver who does not flinch, it does more than comfort, it alters stress chemistry. Oxytocin and other social neuropeptides, the rhythm of shared respiration and the synchrony of co-regulated attention, can blunt the intensity of the threat response. In this sense, the brain is not a solitary engineer, it is a social organ that learns goodness from the people around it. Interventions that aim to help the brain under stress do so by leveraging plasticity. Exposure therapies, practiced carefully and within safe contexts, allow the nervous system to relearn the meaning of cues, that a door slam does not necessarily announce danger, that a memory can be held without being overwhelming. Cognitive behavioral practices teach the brain to re-evaluate predictions, to test assumptions, and to cultivate alternative scripts. Somatic approaches, breath work, movement, gentle touch address the body's stored response patterns and provide new templates for regulation. Even simple, rhythmic activities like walking in nature or tapping out a rhythm with another person can reweave the threads of arousal into less jagged patterns. The science of reconsolidation shows something daring: memories are not locked trunks. When recalled, they open into a period of malleability. In that window, with new safety information or fresh context, the brain can update and sometimes diminish the power of old traumatic responses. This is not erasure of history. We do not and should not pretend that suffering did not happen, but it is the possibility of re-encoding memory so they no longer exhaust today's life. The act of telling one story in a safe space can itself be therapeutic. The narrative reshapes the effective contours of the memory and, with time, the nervous system follows. Biology does not absolve us from the social obligation stress reveals. The distribution of stress is profoundly unequal. Structural forces, poverty, racism, discrimination, unsafe neighborhoods, manufacture environments that keep stress systems battle-ready. Children who grow up in these contexts do not simply choose their hypervigilance, they inherit a logic of survival that will shape their learning, attention, and opportunities. The ethical response is to build systems that reduce unnecessary toxic stress, safer schools, adequate healthcare, decent housing, and workplaces that honor human limits. Healing is, in truth, not only a personal project but a political one. There is also an honest humility to hold. Regulation is not quick. The body's chemistry, the structural changes in dendrites and myelin, the immune patterns, these are not undone like a sudden spell. Recovery often looks like careful repetition, practiced breathing, trusted companionship, meaningful routines, incremental exposure, restored sleep, and the slow return of curiosity. Many people find that meaning-making, making sense of suffering through art, story, ritual, or community, is central to this work. Meaning does not erase pain, it anchors it in an intelligible narrative and gives the brain new scaffolding for interpretation. Post-traumatic growth is a phrase that names a paradox. Some who have been broken by events also report deep changes, new priorities, deeper relationships, a reoriented sense of what matters. Growth is not guaranteed, and it is not a moral requirement. To survive a storm and say that it made one stronger can ring hollow if that claim erases the real losses endured. But for some, deliberate meaning-making becomes part of the rewiring. The brain's reward systems learn to value different things, and new patterns of attention and behavior are practiced into being. Regulation practices themselves have neural signatures. Slow, deep breathing stimulates the vagus nerve and invites parasympathetic tone. Movement and exercise release endorphins and promote neurotrophic factors that support synaptic growth. Sleep consolidates safety learning and removes metabolic byproducts. Social rhythm synchronizes neural circuits across people, making regulation contagious. Artistic expression, music, painting, dance, accesses non-verbal networks and often provides a gentle route into memory reconsolidation, allowing effect to be reshaped without the harshness of words. These are not magic bullets, but they are meaningful tools that the brain, given time and repetition, will integrate. There is also the matter of compassion, especially self-compassion. The brain that has been under fire learns a vocabulary of blame and shame. If only I had, I should have, I am weak. These loops are neural grooves that deepen with each self-reproach. Compassion is an intervention in those loops. To speak to oneself with steadiness, to offer acknowledgement rather than denunciation, to allow mistakes to be instructive, these practices change the inner dialect and, over time, the underlying circuits that habitually assess threat and worth. As with previous chapters, we must be honest about limits. Some injuries, complex, repetitive, or accompanied by neurodegenerative processes, resist full return to a prior baseline. The work then becomes one of adaptation and reimagining what new practices, assistances, and communities can be composed so that life is meaningful within the new capacities. Plasticity affords possibilities, but it does not guarantee a return to what was. And still, even partial restoration and adaptation matter immensely. Endings do not come with tidy triumphs. Recovery from chronic stress and trauma is often an uneven road, punctuated with setbacks and small, luminous gains. The brain under fire is not doomed, and it is not instantly healed by resolve. It asks for steady companions, for policies that reduce unnecessary burdens, for practices that train regulation, and for cultures that understand the long weave between suffering and transformation. As you close this chapter, feel the weight of that image of the city, the sirens, the floodlights, the weary people shifting from barricade to tentative openness. Consider the tiny things that dim the noise for you: a friend's steady presence, a walk at dusk, the ritual of hot water at the end of the day. These are not insignificant. They are threads with which the brain can begin to knit new fabrics of safety. The work is slow, often unheroic, and profoundly human. It asks for courage that is patient rather than flashy, small, consistent acts of care for body, mind, and community that, over time, make living possible again. There is a loom in each of us, a device older than language, whose threads are not wool but moments. Over years and seasons we weave a fabric that we call our life. It is not an exact tapestry of events stitched in immutable order, it is a living weave, worked and reworked, a garment mended more times than it was ever completed. Memory is both the thread and the hand that draws it through the eye. It is how we sit up in the morning and recognize ourselves in the mirror. It is the map that tells us which roads to avoid and which to follow. To speak of neuroplasticity without speaking of memory is to describe a theater and never mention the storyteller whose voice fills the hall. Memory is stranger than we often admit. We imagine it as a filing cabinet where past moments sit safely in labeled folders, retrievable when needed. The truth is more intimate and creative. Memory is an act, a continual process of reconstruction. Each time you call up a scene, you do not merely glance at a photograph, you retell it. You choose the angle, add emphasis, fill in gaps, and in that very retelling you change the material. The hippocampus and related networks do not merely store snapshots, they help stitch context around fragments so that those fragments become meaningful. With each recall, synapses adjust, the memory is reconsolidated, sometimes with new emotional tones, sometimes with softened edges. This is why the story of a childhood event told at 50 can be different from the story told at 30, and why both can be true in their own changing way. There is mercy in the malleability. Consider the person who carries a night-scarred memory of humiliation. Each retelling, perhaps in therapy, perhaps over wine with a friend, can change what the memory cues when it reappears. A memory that once triggered shame can, through compassionate reinterpretation, become a lesson or even a source of empathy. That is the work of rewriting, not erasing the fact, but altering the meaning it carries forward. The rewiring occurs because the recall event opens a brief window when the memory is not yet cemented. Into that window, new information can be woven. The act of naming, of locating a hurt in language, of giving it a context that includes safety and agency, shifts neural textures. The old pathways do not disappear, they are supplemented. The loom learns a new pattern. But there is also risk in this pliability. Memory is political inside us. The narratives we rehearse habitually, I am unlucky, I am unlovable, I always fail, act like dye baths, tinting each new thread with suspicion and preemptive sorrow. To live by a narrow, negative story is to stitch your loom so tightly that alternative patterns struggle to appear. The neuroscience is mercilessly elegant. Patterns repeated have synaptic weight, they are easier to pull up when the mind needs a script. It is not merely psychology. It is material. Once you know this, the ethical stakes deepen. What we tell ourselves matters not because slogans change facts but because they change the biology that governs how those facts get used. Memory is not only private, it is social. Stories are shared goods. Families, friends, and communities are the loom's workshops where narratives are displayed, compared, corrected, and embellished. Think of a family around a table, laughing over a holiday tale. Each person's recollection nudges the others, one remembers the dog, another remembers the rain. Together they create a version of the past that none of them holds alone. This collaborative knitting is a kind of social plasticity. The brain's stories are shaped by what others remember and how they remember it. The consequence is double-edged. Belonging can rescue someone from self-destructive interpretations, but collective memory can also harden into shared resentments, myths that justify hurt, or versions of history that exclude. The social loom can mend or rip. There is a tenderness to this that often goes unnoticed. Think of the elderly woman who sits with a grandchild on her lap and tells a story not because the facts are exact but because the telling itself is service. In that ritual the child learns about origins, the elder learns that she still belongs to a thread that continues. Ritualized memory, tending the same story across decades, singing the same song, visiting the same place, is not superstition. It is a practice that secures identity, linking the biology of memory with the social furniture that holds us. Loss of that ritual can be devastating. Witness the quiet terror when someone with dementia cannot find the name for a child, cannot recall the recipe that once made a house smell like home. The unraveling of memory is not merely cognitive, it is an undoing of the loom's pattern, a loss of the place where threads meet. Forgetting is part of the loom's wisdom. We are mistakenly taught to fear forgetfulness as moral failure. Yet forgetting is not merely an absence, it is a process that clears space. We do not have infinite capacity, and pruning, the brain's way of letting go, is essential for future growth. If every trivial moment were preserved with equal intensity, the present would be cluttered and inefficient. Letting go is adaptive. The danger lies not in the act of forgetfulness but in the accumulation of unprocessed experience that remains emotionally potent even without clear memory. A trauma that is not integrated, whose effect remains lodged in body and habit, is not truly forgotten, it has been displaced into other channels of feeling and action. The wise work of the loom is to weave sorrow into cloth rather than burying it unfinished in the rafters. What, then, is identity? If memory is reconstructive and malleable, if forgetting is adaptive, where is the I that claims continuity? The answer resists a simple metaphysical denouement. Identity is not a single filament but the pattern that emerges from many threads, procedural regularities, narrative choices, relationships, and embodied habits. Some of those threads are thick and ancient, some are new and tentative. The brain's plasticity means that identity is at once stable enough to orient us and flexible enough to evolve. This duality is not anxiety-provoking, it is human-making. We are not the same person at 30 and at 60, and yet we are linked by a through line of concern, narrative preference, and embodied disposition. What changes is the arrangement of priorities and the weight of certain threads. There is a moral tenderness in that observation. Responsibility, often imagined as the property of an immutable soul, becomes a practice within a changing weave. When we recognize that past networks shaped current impulses, moral judgment can soften into a stance of accountability that remains kind. Accountability does not dissolve, consequences still matter, but understanding the brain's plasticity invites interventions that are reparative rather than merely punitive. We can ask, how can we alter the patterns that led to harm? What practices, conversations, and environments will help new threads to hold? Practical repair is often beautifully ordinary. Writing is a loom's tool. The act of keeping a journal is not merely to record but to rehearse. By writing, we slow down the mind's hurried stitches and allow different patterns to be considered. Telling a story to a trusted listener edits memory in real time, speaking gives shape and invites reinterpretation. Rituals, a yearly pilgrimage, a memorial on an anniversary, a photograph taken in a particular way, give context to what otherwise drifts. Creative arts, painting, music, dance, let effect be remixed without the tyranny of precise facts. They create avenues through which memory's heat can cool into form. These are not technical tricks, they are human crafts, ways of tending the loom with steady hands. There is one technology that merits caution, the impulse to control memory by chemical or mechanical means. If memory is the basis of identity, then interventions that erase or dramatically alter memories touch what it means to be oneself. The promise of relief for severe trauma is real and worthy of ethical deliberation, yet there is a danger in reducing the deep moral work of story editing to a quick surgical cut. Memory's role is not only to hold pain, it is to anchor learning, to bind community, and to maintain accountability. The loom's fabric is not always comfortable, but its texture matters. Any tool that alters threads must be wielded with discernment and respect. The storyteller's loom makes us temporal beings in another vital way, it demands engagement with time. Memory is not an inert bank but a conversation across moments. We learn by comparing present possibilities with past outcomes, and by imagining future scenes we prime pathways today that we hope will be easy tomorrow. This triad, past, present, future, is the dynamic grammar of the life we build. Practices that help us to inhabit this grammar well are those that balance honesty and hope, honest appraisal of what occurred and hopeful formation of what may yet be. The brain learns to inhabit new possibilities when we rehearse them with conviction and compassion. The act of imagining a kinder retelling of one's past is not escapism, it is material rehearsal that configures neural readiness for new behavior. There are sorrowful paradoxes here. The very retellings that free us can also be used to bind us. Societies and institutions that insist on unyielding stories of humiliation, superiority, blame, or victimhood can harden neural patterns in entire communities. Collective narratives can be emancipatory or ensnaring. The ethics of memory at a social scale is thus urgent. Which histories do we preserve, which do we soften, and who gets to decide? This is not an abstract debate, it is the terrain of reconciliation, education, and public mourning. The loom of a people's memory either mends the fabric of civic life or tears it further. As this chapter closes, imagine an ordinary evening, a table with a lamp, a photograph whose corners have softened from too many hands. Someone calls your name across the room and asks, "Tell me about the time you felt proud." There is an invitation in that request. To tell a story is to place a thread on the loom where it might be seen and reshaped. It is an act both vulnerable and generative. The garments we wear, our habits, dispositions, and loves, are woven out of such moments. If you wish to test the loom, try this simple, humane experiment. Pick a memory that nags at you and retell it not as proof of your failings but as a scene with context. Who else was present? What pressures curved the moment? What small acts of courage also occurred? Tell it aloud, or write it, or place it inside a ritual. Fold the paper 3 times, burn the edges, tie it with a ribbon, speak of it in a room with someone who steadies you. Notice what shifts in the telling and what shifts in how your chest feels when you later imagine that day. This is not a promise that pain will vanish. It is a demonstration that the loom accepts new threads. The loom is patient and exacting. It refuses haste. The craft of changing memories pool requires time, repetition, and companion hands. But it is among the deepest invitations neuroplasticity gives us, the possibility to become the author of our narrative, not by erasing the darker chapters, but by weaving them into a broader pattern in which sorrow and joy both have place, and in which we can move forward with a margin of freedom previously unavailable. To live with such awareness is to work at the loom with humility and fierce tenderness, to know that what you are making matters not only to you but to those who will someday inherit the fabric. Imagine a small room in which an old potter works the same lump of clay every day. His hands are stained with decades of choices, the wheel spins with a steady inevitability. Some days the clay yields, pliant under the exact pressure of his thumb, other days it fights, cracks forming where humidity is wrong or fatigue has tightened his fingers. With time, However, what the potter learns is not simply technique but a sense for the conditions under which transformation happens, the temperature of the kiln, the rhythm of the wheel, the quality of the water he uses. There is a craft to coaxing change from material. So it is with the brain. Practice is the alchemy of slow rearrangement. It does not conjure new matter from nothing, but it refines the conditions under which existing matter will bend toward new form. Practice is deceptively simple and deeply mysterious. At first blush it is repetition, the same gesture, thought, or exercise enacted again and again. But repetition alone is not the full recipe. The brain responds to patterned input, to novelty within repetition, to meaningful feedback, to rest, to social scaffolding, and to the presence of a body that is neither depleted nor inflamed. The ingredients of effective practice are multiple, and their interplay is often invisible until one looks closely. Take, for instance, the violinist who practices scales in the small hours, each note a precise incision. There is the mechanical repetition of the finger on the string, yes, but laid upon it are micro-adjustments of posture, tiny corrective impulses guided by the ear, and the emotional coloring with which a passage is imagined. After months, then years, the musician's brain will show changes. The motor cortex will have reorganized representation of finger positions, auditory and motor areas will be stitched closer together, the pathways that once required effort will humbly operate. Crucially, these changes are not automatic, they are forged in cycles of effort and consolidation. Intense practice without recovery leads to fatigue and diminishing returns. Practice interleaved with sleep and rest yields durable learning. The potter's hands and the violinist's fingers both know the law: effort must be tempered by care. There is a biochemical ecology to this work. When circuits are engaged, neurotransmitters and growth factors float through the intercellular spaces like gardener's rain. Among these workers is a molecule called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, a kind of fertilizer for synapses. BDNF's presence supports synaptic growth and resilience. Its levels rise in response to exercise, enriched environments, certain kinds of learning, and even optimism. The body's chemistry is not a neutral backdrop, it sculpts the very likelihood that practice will leave a mark. Sleep, again, is the careful kill. During certain phases of sleep, the brain consolidates daytime learning, prunes unnecessary connections, and strengthens important ones. Deprive the brain of sleep and the alchemy slows. The potter's clay dries too fast, cracks form, the form collapses. Movement is often underestimated in accounts of mental change. Walk the city, and you will see how movement choreographs attention. People who move rhythmically, dancers, long-distance runners, report a clarity of mind that is not merely anecdotal. Exercise increases blood flow, releases endorphins, and raises neurotrophic factors. It is as if motion primes the brain for learning, widening the doorway through which new patterns can enter. The body and brain are not separate workshops, they are the same studio under different lights. To practice the mind without tending the body is like trying to fire a pot in a cold kiln. Feedback is the craft's other essential tool. Not all repetition leads to useful rewiring. Blind repetition can calcify errors. The potter's apprentice watches the master's hand, the violinist listens to a teacher's correction. Feedback refines error, calibrates expectations, and prevents the formation of maladaptive patterns. In the brain, this corresponds to error signals that update predictions and adjust synaptic strength. Good practice supplies reliable feedback, timely and specific, guiding the nervous system toward improved maps rather than reinforcing faulty ones. There is an art to the difficulty of practice. The brain is most likely to change when challenged just beyond its current skill, when one is stretched but not shattered. Psychologists call this the zone of proximal development, neuroscientists call it the sweet spot for plasticity. Too easy, and no remodeling is required; too hard, and the system retreats into avoidance. The steady, graded escalation of challenge is how skills are layered into competence. Think of the child learning to balance on a bicycle, parent hands at the back, the space between crash and flight narrowing with each attempt. The learning is not heroic in any grand sense, it is incremental and patient. Meaning infuses the work with tenacity. Practice that is purposeless is easily abandoned, practice tied to values and narrative persists. when people practice music because a melody binds them to a community, or when someone rehabilitates an injured limb because it allows them to hold a child again, the brain receives an additional signal: the change is meaningful. This emotional salience boosts plastic processes, in part because reward circuits light up and tag the practiced pathways as valuable. The science and the poetry converge here. Purpose is not fluff. It is biological fuel. There are technologies now that promise to accelerate the alchemy: neurofeedback, brain stimulation, pharmacological enhancers. Each of these enters the studio like a new tool, potentially useful, potentially dangerous. To the extent that they assist the efficient formation of wanted patterns, they can be instruments of healing. To the extent they are used to shortcut experience, to erase difficulty, or to create advantage without the sweat of practice, they raise ethical alarms. Enhancement without reflection risks a shallow skill, a brittle competence that breaks when context shifts. The potter who uses a machine to spin the wheel faster may produce more pots, but she loses the subtlety earned by rhythm and proximity. The question is not whether tools can help; they can, but to what end and under what terms. Societies, too, are apprenticeships. The cultural rhythms you inherit, what is revered, what is forbidden, what is rewarded, shape which circuits are practiced. Children raised in a culture that praises curiosity are likely to have neural scaffolding more receptive to exploration. Conversely, cultures that reward suppression of feeling teach circuits that make inhibition easier. The moral imperative, then, is that societies design practices that foster thriving, not merely compliance. Education is less about filling heads and more about designing practices that remake brains in humane directions, classrooms that cultivate attention rather than distraction, social rituals that promote empathy rather than alienation. The alchemy is collective as much as it is individual. There is a particular tenderness necessary when practice aims to change suffering into function. Rehabilitation after stroke, for example, is a study in patient, meticulous alchemy. Patients often begin with tiny, absurd movements, lifting a finger, squeezing a ball. Medical devices and therapists provide feedback, guide the timing, and scale challenges. The brain, sensing the repeated signal and invited by meaningful goals, feeding oneself, holding a cup, reorganizes. Nearby regions take over lost functions, new synapses grow, and over months the person regains capacities once assumed lost. The story is both laboratory and liturgy, science and stubborn love braided together. Addiction, too, is a pathology of practice. Compulsive repetition has carved a groove that rewards itself. Recovery requires a repatterning of reinforcement schedules, new routines that provide alternative rewards, removal of triggers that serve as cues, and social settings that reinforce different scripts. This is not a failure of character but a biological consequence of circuits that have learned to prioritize immediate relief. The alchemy here is practical, incremental substitution, community-based reinforcement, and the slow building of identity-aligned habits. It is tedious and often humiliating work, but it is where plasticity reveals its most humane promise, that even the brain bent toward compulsion can be coaxed toward freedom when the conditions for new learning are crafted with care. Creativity provides another face of practice's alchemy. To create is to commit to iterative failure, sketch after sketch, false starts, and surprising moments of coherence. Creative practice trains the brain in a dialectic between constraint and exploration. The mind learns to hold multiple possibilities, to value the odd combination, to recognize patterns across distant domains. Novelty itself becomes a skill. Neural networks learn to flexibly connect previously disparate regions. The creative artist is, in part, a sculptor of attention, deliberately hunting for associations that others overlook. This is not mystical, it is the cognitive cultivation of curiosity. We must not romanticize the path. Practice can be oppressive when imposed without consent, when it becomes an instrument of control rather than liberation. Consider institutions that train obedience rather than judgment, or workplaces that regiment hours in ways that erode sleep and inflate stress. The same mechanisms that make disciplined practice useful for becoming virtuous can also make indoctrination possible. Plasticity, like a knife, can feed or wound. The moral question is, who sets the curriculum of practice, and whose ends does it serve? The ethics of teaching and of being taught thus become central. A teacher's role is not merely to transmit facts but to design conditions for sustainable change, to pace difficulty, to supply meaningful feedback, to attend to rest and to body, and to link practice to humane ends. Good pedagogy aligns with neural truth. It respects attention, it honors sleep, it uses spaced repetition, and it embeds learning in social context. Bad pedagogy disregards biology and, in doing so, squanders potential and sometimes causes harm. In the small acts of daily life, the alchemy of practice is always at work. The parent who insists on reading one page each night with a child is doing neurobiology, language circuits are strengthened, attention is trained, and a social ritual is created that links reading with warmth. The person who decides, with humility, to practice listening rather than answering in conversation is rewriting interpersonal circuits. The couple who creates a ritual of sitting together after dinner to recount their day builds a scaffold that supports regulation and intimacy. These ordinary practices, repeated across years, are the slow, patient work that composes character and cultures. And there is a final, tender truth: practice reshapes desire. The brain's valuation systems are themselves plastic. What you practice, you learn to want. A novice who begins to run may initially despise the ache, but repeated mornings can change the taste. The body begins to anticipate the runner's high, the mind learns to notice small improvements, and desire shifts. This is the secret many self-help books obliquely miss. Change is not merely imposition upon desire but often the remaking of desire itself. The self you hope to become is partly the result of the cravings you cultivate. So return to the potter, to the small studio, to hands that have learned the language of clay. Practice is a craft that requires humility, the recognition that change is not instantaneous, that conditions matter, that the body and society in which one learns are as vital as the mind itself. It asks for patience, the kind of patience that understands the slow accrual of competence, and for tenderness toward the self when progress falters. If you are to begin a practice tomorrow, consider this modest map. Choose a small, meaningful act, attach it to a context that reminds you, ensure sleep and movement are honored, seek timely feedback from someone you trust, and frame the work as an experiment rather than a verdict. Do not expect revelation after a single attempt, expect, instead, the gradual accumulation of small changes that, over weeks and months, will alter the architecture of your mind. The alchemy of practice is not a promise of omnipotence. Limits exist, genetics, illness, and social constraints set bounds. But within those bounds, the potter's hands show us the world's generosity and material response when tended with respect. The brain will trade labor for change, and the trade is often fairer than we imagine. What we give it, attention, movement, rest, relationship, meaning, it will, in time, return in new capacities, new loves, and new freedoms. Sit with the thought that no mind ever really grows alone. From the first heartbeat that tucks itself into the warmth of another body, to the stories we trade over coffee in the evening, our neural lives are braided with other people's. The brain is not an island of private codes, it is a conversation by other means, a system tuned to the music of company. If neuroplasticity teaches us that wiring changes with use, then much of our most consequential use is social. We learn in each other's light, we rehearse identities together, and we become the people we are because others have looked back and answered. The earliest and most intimate of these dialogues happens at the boundary between infant and caregiver. A new child's cry is raw data, pitch, urgency, rhythm, but it becomes a pattern of meaning when a caregiver responds with eye contact, a soft voice, a hand steadiness. Those responses do not merely comfort the infant in the moment, they shape neural circuits that will later govern attention, affect regulation, and trust. The infant's nervous system is listening for contingency. Does the world answer when I reach? Over months and years, patterned responses scaffold expectancies about safety. Secure attachment is not a sentimental phrase only for psychologists, it is a neural architecture that favors exploration, social learning, and resilience. Conversely, early neglect or unpredictable care calibrates the brain toward vigilance and mistrust. The lesson is stark: our earliest social contexts are prosthetic to our biology. Mirroring is one of the quiet languages through which this social tuning happens. When you watch someone smile, when you feel a jolt at the sight of someone in pain, parts of your own brain echo those states. Neuroscientists once pointed to so-called mirror neurons as the cellular hint of this resonance. What matters beyond labels is that your nervous system is predisposed to resonate with the observed actions and emotions of others. This resonance makes learning efficient. We can acquire skills by watching, we can map another's intention without a long verbal explanation, and we can, often without effort, feel the shape of another's sadness. Empathy begins as neural mimicry and then, with higher-level reflection, becomes understanding and moral response. It is how we tune ourselves toward each other. There is a literally measurable synchrony to social life. When people sing together, their breathing becomes coordinated. When a teacher and student genuinely connect, their brains show patterns of coupling that predict learning. When lovers converse, heart rates and neural rhythms can fall into tandem. This interbrain synchrony is not mystical, it is a physiological hallmark that group presence organizes attention and aligns perception. Rituals, too, communal meals, dances, collective prayers, are cultural technologies for synchrony. They shape attention, scaffold emotion, and anchor memory. The social world supplies repeated contexts in which the brain learns what matters and how to respond. The social brain is also a learning machine for culture. Language, norms, and practices do not download into our heads individually, they diffuse across networks of imitation, instruction, and reinforcement. Children learn accents, gestures, and moral judgments by absorbing the patterns around them. Entire communities habituate certain ways of perceiving the world: what is dangerous, what is beautiful, what is forgivable. This is plasticity at scale. The same neural mechanisms that enable an individual to learn a new instrument enable societies to transmit cuisine, law, and art across generations. Culture is memory externalized, a scaffold for the brain's plastic making. The moral weight of this is heavy. If our brains are shaped by the people around us, then the social environments we inhabit are not epiphenomenal, they are formative. Schools that celebrate curiosity and craft attention teach children neural habits of exploration. Workplaces that normalize constant interruption train attention to fragment. Neighborhoods of chronic fear sculpt vigilance into children's brains. Policy and design matter because they change the contexts in which millions of nervous systems are being trained. To change the brain at a social scale, to plant better neural habits, we must change the social architectures that produce them. But the social brain has a dark flank. The same resonance that fosters compassion can also be harnessed to manipulate. Propaganda, targeted persuasion, the architecture of persuasive technologies, they exploit our predisposition to imitate, to conform, to feel group-affiliated reward. Social media magnifies this by making cues immediate and feedback-looped. Likes, shares, and comments are cheap reinforcements that teach attention to narrow themes, often outrage or spectacle. The plastic brain adapts rapidly to what is rewarded. When trivial engagement is the currency, neural priorities may warp, quick reactivity is strengthened, reflective depth is weakened. Collective attention becomes a product that trains billions of minds. This is not an abstract concern. It is a crisis of the social learning system. What we habitually attend to as a culture rewires how we attend at an individual level. There is also the phenomenon of social transmission of suffering. Trauma does not stop at the person who endured it. Patterns of vigilance, avoidance, and silence can pass through communities like weather patterns. Families that have known violence for generations develop scripts that keep new members' nervous systems primed for threat. Societies can inherit woundings. Historical injustices leave cultural legacies that shape expectations and behavior across time. Healing in such contexts cannot be solely individual therapy. It requires collective rituals of acknowledgement, spaces for shared testimony, policies that redress structural harms, and practices that create safe repetition. The social brain needs not just solitary practice but aligned communal work to rewire maladaptive patterns at scale. Yet the social brain also houses some of our best tools for repair. Peer support, mutual aid, and collective mourning are interventions that take advantage of plasticity's social dimension. When people tell their stories to those who listen without judgment, the nervous system can recalibrate, shame loosens its grip, and alternative scripts become possible. Group therapies and community-based rehabilitation programs often succeed where isolated approaches fail, in part because they provide the social reward and the repeated contexts that reinforce new neural pathways. Rituals of reconnection, reconciliation ceremonies, truth commissions, communal memorials, are not mere symbolism, they are practices that organize attention and emotion in ways that make neural change more likely. There is a surprising science behind kindness. Social contact releases molecules associated with bonding and trust, and these chemicals make certain forms of plasticity easier. Oxytocin, while a simplification when treated as a single love hormone, is associated with increased social salience and trust in some contexts. Dopaminergic reward circuits respond not only to food and novelty but to being seen, validated, and included. Thus, social reward can serve as fertilizer for the practices we wish to promote. Building communities of practice, a local chorus, a neighborhood gardening group, a reading circle, creates repeated social reinforcement for skills and values we deem important. In that sense, friendship and belonging are not luxuries, they are neural infrastructure. The social brain also has limits and biases. Humans favor in-group signals. We are wired to trust familiar faces and mistrust strangers until experience suggests otherwise. Stereotypes and prejudices find receptive neural soil because they simplify social cognition. Overcoming these deep, socially learned biases requires longer work, repeated positive contact, narrative change, institutional reform, and the cultivation of practices that make otherness familiar in humane contexts. Education that exposes children to diverse peers, stories that humanize rather than demonize, and public rituals that celebrate plural belonging are all ways to use plasticity deliberately. Technology can both impede and assist the social brain. Virtual communities can be lifelines for those isolated by geography or illness. They can also become echo chambers that reward extremity. Emerging tools, from carefully designed platforms that promote deliberative exchange to community-driven peer support apps, can scaffold better learning if they are created with knowledge of social plasticity in mind. The ethical imperative is to shape technologies that honor human attention and social reward rather than exploit them. Designing platforms as places for sustained, safe, and meaningful exchange is an act of public neuroethics. Finally, there is a private moral lab where social plasticity matters most, the small practices of ordinary life. The neighbor who listens without interrupting, the parent who models repair after a misstep, the friend who consistently shows up, these are the unspectacular acts that train attention and safety. Love, when practiced, is a training regimen for the brain. To choose, again and again, to reflect before reacting, to ask, "How are you?" and then remain present, to forgive small trespasses and to hold boundaries when necessary, these micro-practices weave the social fabric in ways that change neural architecture over time. They are the quiet politics of plasticity. As you close this chapter, think of the people with whom you most often share your days. Consider how your presence trains them, and how theirs trains you. The social brain asks for stewardship. If our habits collectively shape what future minds will become, then tending the social world is not philanthropy alone, it is a form of public nursing for the next generation's neural garden. There is grace here, none of us are wholly responsible alone for what we become. There is also responsibility, what we do together, the rituals we keep, the stories we repeat, the attention we reward, will echo in the wiring of those who come after. There is a particular hush that falls over a hospital corridor at night, a small, disciplined quiet that is equal parts hope and fear. In that hush, a surgeon pauses outside a door, a researcher reviews lines of data, a patient waits for a prognosis. It is here, in the dim space between bedside lamp and fluorescent clinic, that the most modern, most intimate conversations about neuroplasticity happen, whether to stimulate, to medicate, to nudge, or to leave well enough alone. The technologies and markets that promise to alter the brain's wiring arrive like a new class of tools, some steadier than others, some luminous and some crude, and with them arrive complex moral questions that reach right into what it means to be human. We live now in a moment when the idea of changing the brain is no longer purely the province of rehabilitation and therapy. There is a flourishing industry, devices, drugs, apps, protocols, that speaks in the language of possibility, faster learning, better mood, enhanced focus, performance at a level previously reserved for virtue or luck. For the person who has been denied a capacity by illness, such breakthroughs are mercy. For others, they read as tempting shortcuts, an exam to be aced, a shift to be survived, a distinction to be secured. The core tension is this: the same mechanisms that can restore a voice or a hand can also enlarge inequalities, erode meaning, and refract responsibility into hard-to-navigate questions. Imagine Naomi, a graduate student whose world narrows to deadlines and the hum of coffee machines. An advertisement, thin, persuasive, bright, promises cognitive clarity with a discreet wearable, or a pill that sharpens attention without the jitter of caffeine. Naomi is tired in a particular, modern way. She is exhausted not only by work but by the social expectation that rest is a luxury. The devices and substances on offer do not merely promise function, they promise a new kind of freedom, to perform more, to be more productive, to keep up. There is relief in the offer. There is also a cost that is not easily priced, dependent on a market, the slow reshaping of expectations, both her own and those of her peers, and the risk of shifting what success looks like from being sustainable to being enhanced. Contrast Naomi's quiet temptation with Kareem, who owes his regained speech to a clinician who placed an implant in a previously silent area of his damaged cortex. His recovery is not cosmetic, it is repair. For him, the machine is a partner in reclaiming a life that injury had withdrawn. For him, the ethical ledger is clearer: the intervention relieves suffering, restores agency, and reknits relationships. But not all cases fall so cleanly into therapy versus enhancement. The boundary blurs: is improving concentration beyond baseline to pass an exam enhancement or a remediation of disadvantage? When a treatment becomes available only to those who can pay, what begins as a private good quickly compounds a social inequality. This slippage, between therapy and enhancement, between remedy and advantage, is a central ethical knot. Historically, medicine sought to return people to a baseline of health. Enhancement expands the palette: we can potentially alter memory strength, emotion regulation, attention span, and impulse control not only for people impaired by injury or disease but for those who seek marginal advantages. The moral question is not merely whether we can do these things but whether we should, for whom, and under what constraints. A society that normalizes enhancement risks creating new expectations that become coercive: employers preferring enhanced workers, schools favoring pupils who take cognitive aids, relationships strained by mismatched capacities. Enhancement can shift from optional improvement to implicit obligation. Another dimension is consent and vulnerability. People in crisis, grieving, desperate, overworked, are more likely to accept interventions whose risks have not been fully understood or whose long-term consequences remain opaque. Ethical practice demands more than a signed form: it asks for processes of deliberation that are slow and humane, that give space to doubt, second opinions, and time. The history of medicine is littered with experiments conducted in contexts of unequal power. We cannot afford to let economic imperatives or technological fervor reenact those patterns on the neural level. The brain is not a commodity solely at someone's disposal. Choices about altering it require attuned consent and societal guardrails. Authenticity is another tender, sticky thread. People ask, sometimes with trembling intensity, whether an altered mood or sharpened memory is still them. These questions are not merely sentimental. Our sense of self is interwoven with memories, habits, and patterns of feeling. When interventions change those patterns, identity shifts. For some, that shift is liberation: a depression lifted opens new possibilities for love and work. For others, the shift can be disorienting: achievements may feel hollow if they were produced by external cognitive aid, relationships may strain when emotional palettes change. Philosophers beg us to ask, what is the right balance between relieving suffering and maintaining continuity of the narrative self? Clinicians and families must navigate this practically, often without clear playbooks. There are also institutional pressures that shape individual choice. Military and corporate actors have long been interested in any edge that yields performance. The logic is straightforward: if a technology reliably increases endurance or focus, institutions will consider adopting it. The ethical problem emerges when individual autonomy collides with institutional incentive. If a soldier is offered a performance enhancer in the name of mission success, is consent truly free? If a company suggests a device to increase productivity and implicitly rewards those who use it, does the worker have real choice? Coercion can be subtle when it is woven into reward structures, and societies need norms that protect the genuinely voluntary character of such choices. Regulatory and social governance lag behind technological capability. Devices and apps proliferate faster than evidence accumulates. Markets are nimble, ethics and law are slower, necessarily slower, since they must steward more than profit. This time lag produces a liminal space in which people experiment on themselves with ambiguous oversight. The responsible course is not to halt innovation but to insist on robust evaluation, long-term follow-up, and public deliberation. Scientific curiosity must be yoked to humility. Technologies that touch the brain deserve special scrutiny because their effects are not only short-term but can cascade into lifelong patterns of behavior and identity. Equity must be central to the conversation. If life-enhancing neurotechnologies remain accessible only to the wealthy, social strata will calcify in new ways. The gap between those who can afford cognitive scaffolds and those who cannot might become as significant as disparities in education or health are today. Policy has a role. Public funding priorities, equitable access programs, and regulations that prevent private monopolies on basic neuroenhancements could shape a fairer future. But policy cannot do all the work. Cultures of solidarity and ethical markets must also evolve. The question is not merely philanthropic, how to give access, but political, what kind of society do we want? We must also speak honestly about the limits and the hype. The popular imagination loves a shortcut, marketing amplifies it. Yet the brain is a complex organ nested in a body and embedded in a social world. Simple claims, "This device will triple your memory," should be greeted with skepticism. The most effective interventions combine context, practice, rest, and sometimes modest technological aid. There are no miracles, there are trade-offs. Responsible communication from scientists and companies is not merely ethical nicety, it protects people from false hope and preserves the credibility of the field. Research ethics, too, must be refined. Longitudinal studies that examine social and psychological outcomes, not only immediate cognitive metrics, are essential. We need knowledge about how interventions interact with identity, relationships, socio-economic status, and cultural values. This knowledge must be made public in accessible forms, not gated behind paywalls or corporate secrecy. Open science and community-engaged research are methods that honor both the complexity of the brain and the rights of people whose lives will be affected. There is a generative moral imagination that offers alternatives to the market-first logic. Public deliberation, democratized decision-making about research priorities, and community-informed governance can shape how neurotechnology is developed and deployed. Imagine councils composed of patients, caregivers, ethicists, clinicians, and laypersons who review proposed uses of brain-altering technologies. Imagine community labs that teach people about risks and benefits without coercion. Imagine employers that commit to not requiring enhancement for performance, and schools that focus on enriching environments rather than promoting pharmacological crutches. These are not utopian niceties, they are practical constraints that defend dignity. Finally, there is a personal dimension that resists tidy policy, how to hold technological possibility with humane restraint. The temperament this demands is not Luddite denial but a steady, discerning curiosity. It asks us to be willing to test, to try, to rest, to consult, and to accept limits. It asks for narratives of meaning that are not contingent solely on capacity and efficiency but on relationships, purpose, and the slow cultivation of character. To embrace neuroplasticity is to accept that we can and will change. To embrace neuroethics is to insist that such change be stewarded with justice, consent, and humility. As the night deepens in that hospital corridor, the surgeon steps away from the lamp, the patient sleeps with the faint clatter of machines, the researcher closes a notebook. The promise of rewiring, to heal, to learn, to become, sits close beside the risk of commodifying the soul's instruments. The work of this age, then, is twofold: to use technology in ways that alleviate suffering and expand opportunity, and to guard against a market logic that would make enhancement the measure of human worth. This is not merely a task for experts, it is a civic project. The brain is private and public at the same time, private in the sense that it houses our subjectivity, public in the sense that the conditions under which it changes belong to the society we build together. If you find yourself tempted by the gleam of a new device or the promise of a pill, pause and ask gently, whose need does this serve? What does it cost me in terms of dependence on a market or the reshaping of my narrative self? Who else bears the consequences of this choice? These are not prohibitions, they are questions that summon attention. In answering them, we participate not only in our own rewiring but in the larger work of shaping a world where tools of the mind are used to heal and to enhance human flourishing, and never, without examination, to define it. There is a quiet terror that comes with the knowledge that we can change the machinery of mind. It settles in the chest like cool rain when you first realize that habit is not fate, that trauma can be softened, that skill can be grown. Suddenly the world is less deterministic and more fragile. Our choices, our institutions, our markets, all of them, become hands capable of shaping brains in ways both luminous and dangerous. The paradox is that power to rewire brings with it a double duty, to enable flourishing and to prevent harm. To be a steward of plasticity is to learn a new type of ethics, one that must weigh biology, history, narrative, and power at once. Stewardship begins small. It is the teacher who notices a child's hesitation and responds with a question that invites curiosity rather than shame. It is the clinician who explains not only the mechanics of an intervention but the ways it may alter a person's experience of self. It is the friend who sees a loved one collapsing into destructive routine and offers reliable companionship rather than blunt advice. Good stewardship honors the slowness of change and refrains from treating plasticity like a fast cosmetic fix. It respects the body's pacing, the necessity of rest, the role of relationship and meaning. In these ordinary acts we see the ethics of care, a willingness to accompany rather than simply correct, to create contexts that invite non-linear healing rather than impose linear solutions. Yet stewardship quickly scales to harder questions. Who decides which minds will be changed, and toward what ends? When society offers programs to improve attention, is improvement defined by communal flourishing or by market efficiency? When a school adopts cognitive training, does it aim to enrich students' capacities for wonder or to raise test scores for institutional prestige? The steward's paradox is that good intentions are insufficient. A well-meaning policy that organizes children into endless drills of attention may produce short-term gains and long-term narrowing of curiosity. The measure of a stewardship is not the immediacy of its gains but the health of the life it helps make possible. Power complicates everything. Neuroplasticity does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs where goods, resources, and authority accumulate. Those with money can purchase therapies, devices, and environments that facilitate certain types of learning and recovery. Those without money often face conditions, food insecurity, chaotic housing, under-resourced schools, that blunt the brain's capacity for adaptive plasticity. Stewardship therefore requires an account of justice, not merely the ethical deployment of technology but the social reorganization necessary to make environments conducive to healthy rewiring. It is insufficient to hand an individual a cognitive enhancer and declare the job done. One must also ask why some people are so burdened that they seek such aids. True stewardship is as much about changing the world that trains brains as it is about changing the brains themselves. There is a moral delicacy around the question of agency and responsibility when plasticity is the medium. If someone's aggression, addiction, or withdrawal was sculpted by years of neglect or violence, how should we hold them accountable? The neural view does not absolve moral responsibility, but it complicates the terms under which judgment is fair. A society oriented by the stewardship ethic will lean toward corrective conditions, restorative justice, reparation, education, rather than mere punishment. It will ask, how can we construct environments that teach different habits, reward different virtues, and provide the scaffolds for new stories? To respond with punitive isolation is to repeat the same engineering of minds through negative means. To repair, we must be willing to re-engineer social conditions with compassion and intentionality. Consent becomes another knotty terrain. Changing a person's brain without their informed, reflective agreement, or coercing them into change through economic or institutional pressures, is an abuse not merely of rights but of personhood. In contexts where enhancement becomes a de facto requirement, job cultures that valorize always-on productivity, schools that reward pharmacological focus, consent is hollow. Ethical stewardship demands that alternatives be available, that refusal is not punitive, and that deliberation about interventions be public, slow, and accompanied by safeguards. Consent is not a signature on a form, it is the social and institutional context that makes a refusal real. The steward's work also includes care for narrative continuity. Many people who endure interventions, pharmacological, technological, psychotherapeutic, wonder whether the person who emerges is still them. The anxiety is legitimate. Identity is woven from memory, habit, preference, and relation. When any of those are altered, disorientation can follow. Stewardship therefore treats identity as something to be held with sensitivity. Intervention should be presented as options that might change feeling and preference. They should be accompanied by support for restoring one's life. There is deep compassion in walking with someone as they learn to incorporate new capacities into an evolving narrative. It is a form of moral accompaniment. We do not only change brains, we help persons inhabit the changes. At a structural level, stewardship means designing systems that cultivate capacities we value, schools that teach attention and empathy, workplaces that respect limits and foster meaningful rituals, urban designs that encourage movement and social connection, public policies that reduce toxic stress by providing stable housing, healthcare, and social support. When we speak of neuroplasticity as a public good, we must then ask how public infrastructure can become the medium through which brains flourish. Redistributing resources is not merely a matter of fairness, it is a strategy for collective neural health. Public libraries, parks, community centers, these are not luxury amenities but investments in the environmental scaffolds that support adaptive plasticity across generations. There is also an obligation to humility in the face of ignorance. Neuroscience is young enough that many devices and claims outpace understanding. Stewardship includes the discipline to withhold widespread deployment until long-term effects are known. It requires robust, transparent research and, perhaps most importantly, the willingness to listen to people whose lives are shaped by interventions. The voices of patients, teachers, caregivers, and communities are not anecdotal distractions, they are crucial datasets. Ethical stewardship is participatory, it democratizes the knowledge production about what works and what harms. This ethic must stretch into the global sphere. Cultures differ in values, rituals, and conceptions of the good life. Universal prescriptions about rewiring risk imposing one culture's ideals upon another. Stewardship, in its best form, recognizes plural visions of flourishing and honors local practices that have been stabilizing for generations. It insists on dialogue rather than unilateral export of technological solutions. Development aid that brings neurotechnologies without building local consent and infrastructure risks creating dependence or cultural dissonance. A global stewardship recognizes sovereignty of ways of living even as it shares scientific knowledge that can alleviate suffering. There is a spiritual dimension to stewardship that is often overlooked. Changing a brain is not simply an engineering problem, it is also an existential practice. Who do we wish to become together? What values do we enshrine in institutions? How do we cultivate reverence for limits, for mystery, for mortality? The steward understands that plasticity affords possibility but does not erase the need for restraint. The temper of stewardship is not triumphalist. It resists the siren song of limitless enhancement and instead cultivates a certain restraint, the refusal to convert every human ache into a marketable problem. Sometimes the right stewardship is to foster acceptance and deep presence rather than to fix what could be shown to be, under careful reflection, integral to a meaningful life. Finally, stewardship requires courage to transform systems that currently degrade neural flourishing. That courage is political and personal. It is the legislator who votes for universal pre-K because early enrichment shapes lifelong trajectories. It is the employer who rejects always-on expectations, designing meaningful work rhythms that protect sleep and attention. It is the clinician who insists on social supports as part of treatment. It is the neighbor who organizes meals for a grieving family rather than suggesting quick fixes. These are small acts that, taken together, compose a social architecture of care. In the quiet that follows, return to that hush in the hospital corridor. The steward is not only the biomedical innovator or the policymaker, she is also the person who sits awake with another in crisis, who refuses to be hurried by markets and who recognizes the moral stakes of changing minds. The paradox remains: with the capacity to rewire, we gain the responsibility to do so justly, gently, and wisely. To be stewards is to commit to that impossible balance, enabling freedom without coercion, offering repair without erasing, distributing tools without deepening inequality, honoring identity while enabling change. As you close this chapter, consider the small stewardly acts in your own reach: refusing to praise constant busyness, listening deeply to someone whose suffering is a call for help rather than a problem to be fixed, choosing institutions that consider human limits when designing expectations. Stewardship begins in these intimate places and scales outward. It is not a heroic gesture but a steady ethic, a set of practices that slowly rewrites the social conditions that train our brains. The paradox is not to be solved once and for all. It is the ongoing moral work of living in the knowledge that what we teach our brains, we teach to each other. There is a moment, late in the day, when the light in a room tilts toward gold and everything looks both older and more possible. In that light you can see the tiny imperfections in a table's grain and the faint fingerprints left by a child long grown. It is a moment in which time appears both as loss and as material, as if you might scoop the hours like wet clay and shape them again. If neuroplasticity has been our map and the previous chapters our tools, then this final chapter is the hand that places the map on the table and asks, softly, what will you do with it? What covenant will you make with your own becoming? A covenant is not a contract signed in ink, it is a promise lived out in habits and stories, in the daily return to practices that matter. To say that the brain can be rewired is to issue a gentle invitation and a sober warning at once: invitation because possibility exists, warning because the world will always present reasons to default to old paths. This final page must hold both tenderness and rigor. It must be honest about the limits of transformation and ardent about the moral imperative to tend what can be tended. Remember Amina, who relearned the timid movements of a hand after stroke. Remember Naomi, tempted by quick fixes because exhaustion is a social fact. Remember Kareem, whose implant returned a voice and with it the labor of reintegrating identity. Their stories swirl together like threads of different colors in the same loom. Each is testimony. The brain will change in response to care, practice, and context, but the conditions for change matter as much as the intention. There is a responsibility here to the self and an obligation to the social world that frames every attempt at rewiring. Begin, then, with humility. Plasticity is not a promise of omnipotence. Genetics, early life, illness, structural injustice, these are not mere footnotes, they are determinants that shape possibilities. The recognition of limitation is not defeat. It is a wiser beginning. Humility opens the mind to slow, patient methods. It counsels us to design lives that respect sleep, nourish the body, allow for steady practice, and cultivate relationships that will bear witness and offer repair. Humility asks that we treat our own struggle with the same compassion we would give another, curiosity rather than shame when progress halts, space rather than condemnation when old grooves reassert themselves. Coupled with humility must be courage. Many forms of rewiring require risk: the risk of looking honestly at habits that have protected us at a cost, the risk of seeking help and naming wounds, the risk of choosing a slow practice over instantaneous gratification. Courage here is not the theatrical heroism we imagine. It is the stubbornness to come back, day after day, to the small altars that make change possible, the 20 minutes of deliberate practice, the refusal of a counterproductive device at the cost of short-term convenience, the hard conversation that begins repair. Courage is also social: the willingness to demand better policies, to hold institutions to account, to vote for public goods that reduce toxic stress and widen opportunity. Practice and relationship remain the primary engines of change. Do not be seduced into thinking that technology or a single therapeutic moment will do all the work. Tools can assist, they can be profound medicine in contexts of injury and illness. But they will not replace the need for repeated, meaningful action embedded in nourishing contexts. The soundest investments are not only in gadgets but in the infrastructures of daily life: preschool programs that scaffold early development, workplaces that enforce reasonable hours and honor rest, public parks that invite movement and community, schools that teach attention and empathy alongside facts. These are the public rituals that train neural circuits at scale. Meaning is the hearth around which practice warms. When practice is tethered to a story that matters, to a child's laugh, to a community's flourishing, to a vow to care for oneself into old age, the brain's reward systems provide fuel that makes repetition bear fruit. Without meaning, repetition is brittle. With it, even failure becomes informative. Rituals built around values are the scaffolding of habit formation across a lifetime. If you wish to plant a new neural path, find some soil of value in which it can root. Let the why be larger than the what. We must also accept the moral necessity of shared stewardship. The knowledge of plasticity is not license for individual obsession. It is a call to collective responsibility. The conditions under which brains thrive are largely publicly determined: income inequality, access to healthcare, stable housing, education, the safety of neighborhoods. If we claim that people can choose to rewire, while leaving many to grapple with chronic stress and scarcity, we commit a cruelty. We blame the borrower for a debt not of their making. Justice demands that we use our collective power to create environments that make flourishing easier and coercion less likely. This is not a technocratic platitude, it is a political imperative as much as an ethical one. There will be temptations to treat rewiring as a performance metric. Cultures of productivity will seek to monetize attention, to value only those capacities that yield market advantage. Resist this narrowing. A life well lived includes contemplative depth, the capacity to suffer without being reduced to productivity, and the ability to savor moments that cannot be scored on a ledger. Our ethic of plasticity must guard against converting human worth into cognitive output. We must design institutions that honor rest, relationship, and meaning, not only metrics. Forgiveness deserves an explicit place in this covenant. The brain remembers the sting of blame in ways that embed shame into habit. Forgiveness, of self and of others, is a practice that rewires circuits of reactivity into circuits of openness. It does not excuse harm, it frees energy to build new patterns. Forgiveness is a discipline, it involves narrative reframing, corrective actions, and sometimes boundary setting. In the neural lab, forgiveness loosens the habitual loops that anchor resentment and frees attention for other pursuits. On the social stage, it allows communities to rebuild trust and to invent systems of accountability that restore rather than solely punish. In the quiet ethics of day-to-day life, small acts add up. The neighbor who brings soup to a family in crisis, the teacher who corrects with dignity rather than derision, the employer who honors parental leave, these are not incidental niceties. They are neural infrastructure. They insert patterns of safety, predictability, and value into the lives of others, making adaptive plasticity more likely. As you move through the world, consider what tiny acts you can perform that will, in aggregate, change the contours of someone else's brain toward more flourishing. Technology and markets will press forward whether or not we are prepared. Our response must be to shape them with foresight and care. We should encourage innovations that heal and restore, regulate those that coerce or exacerbate inequalities, and demand long-term, public interest research into effects on identity and society. We must insist on democratic deliberation, equitable access, and transparency. Technologies that alter the mind should be subjected to public scrutiny that is as rigorous and morally invested as the technology's creators. The future of neural tools is not merely a matter of science, it is a civic decision about the kind of people we want to become. There is a spiritual frame that many find useful, that human life is a practice of attention. Whatever your metaphysical commitments, the simple truth persists: attention sculpts the brain. What you spend it on, you become. This is not an accusation but an observation. It is also an opening: if attention is a kind of currency, then choose its expenditures carefully. Spend it on friends, on the slow art of care, on learning that enlarges compassion rather than narrows self-interest. Spend it on practices that make you kinder, steadier, and more present. The returns compound. Finally, we must hold a posture of generous curiosity toward change itself. Neuroplasticity is not merely a tool for self-improvement under the discipline of will, it is a revelation about what it means to be a living, responsive person. To know that we can be rewired is to know that we are permanently open to novelty, to regret, to repair, to surprise. This knowledge can be terrifying or exhilarating. The wiser response is to accept both feelings. Build systems that honor limits, cultivate practices that leverage slow returns, and allow for rest and celebration when small successes arrive. If this book has been a companion for your thinking, let this last chapter be a companion for your doing. Choose a small daily practice that matters to you and to someone else, a 10-minute conversation without distraction, a short walk with a neighbor, a deliberate act of listening, a bedtime ritual that honors rest. Do it again tomorrow. Notice how your chest changes. Let the practice be woven into social life so that it meets reinforcement not only from your will but from relationships and ritual. Over months and years the biology will follow. That is not a promise of perfection but a promise of possibility. As the light in the room finally turns from gold to dusk, remember this: to tend the brain is to tend a life, and to tend a life is to tend a world. Neuroplasticity gives us the knowledge that change is possible, stewardship gives us the reasons to make it just. May your covenant of becoming be tempered by humility, fed by courage, and anchored in care for yourself and for the other lives you will touch. In the end, the most radical, most faithful act is simple: to show up, again and again, with attention, compassion, and steadiness, and to let the slow work of rewiring make room for a life worth living.